Did you know there was a time when people thought solitary reading was selfish? I know it kind of sounds crazy. Right now, we picture a solitary reader as an educated person, maybe a thoughtful person, maybe even a good person. I'll talk more about that later. Victorians thought that reading as a group could be used as a moral exercise, and reading alone, at the very best, a withdrawal from society, and at the worst, maybe even dangerous, especially if you were a woman. In this video, we will explore this time period where communal reading was the norm, and we'll talk about the pros and the cons that this period had. And then later in the video, we'll compare it a little bit to our modern reading habits and talk about if we lost something and also what we gained. Due to the subject of this essay, this is a Western perspective, mainly from the United Kingdom, some extent the United States. If you would like more reading essays from around the world, let me know. The virtues of reading together. The practice of reading aloud brought families, communities, and even strangers together. It fostered community and even oftentimes brought literature to the illiterate. More on that soon. Did you know that most Charles Dickens novels were originally serialized? There were some towards the end of his life that were just published as novels, but in the beginning they were oftentimes put out as serials, meaning that there were portions of the novel published every week or month, not as one whole novel. Some examples of his novels that were originally serialized include The Pickwick Papers, Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, Bleak House, and Great Expectations. And part of the reason was to make literature more accessible. A serialized novel over time would cost about 2/3 of the cost of a bound volume that was all together, so it was more affordable to read these novels when they were serialized, but that's not the only purpose. It was also because the format in which they were released encouraged communal reading. It created suspense and anticipation and wanting to know what was going to happen in the next installment within the context of a communal space where you are reading together, everyone potentially on the edge of their seat. And it's easy to picture a middle class or upper class parlor when we talk about reading, especially in this Victorian period. But honestly, literature got a lot more to the lower classes than you might expect. People with working class backgrounds oftentimes still heard a lot of the famous stories, especially something like Charles Dickens novels, in public spaces. Lower class homes were not really a good place for this because they were very crowded and the lighting wasn't good, and oftentimes like half the neighborhood would live in a house. So obviously there's not so much of a reading at home thing for the working class individuals, but in public they absolutely did. There were readings that were in the park, at churches. There were a lot of like penny readings where you'd pay a very low fee and be able to watch performance, and there was actual theatrical renditions of novels available around, sometimes at an affordable price. And this is how a lot of times people who were illiterate would still be able to engage with these texts and still be able to engage with literature because they can hear someone else recite it and still think on it and still try to understand the deeper meanings that were behind the text. So not only was communal reading a way to foster community, but it was also a way to bring literature to people who otherwise wouldn't have been able to access it in other methods. In addition to a shared communal experience and inviting the people who couldn't read into the world of literature, reading aloud had other social benefits. One was education. Reading aloud improved literacy and public speaking skills and the ability to enter public discourse with other people, as you would stop between passages of text and discuss what the author is trying to say. Also, in the time period before formalized public education, reading aloud and reading with your family or with your community was really important as you were learning to read in general. Not that I love our public education system now or anything, but when you don't have it at all, you definitely need to read with other people there to hear you. And before I talk about the cons of the practice of reading aloud in this time period, I don't want to gloss over the deep emotional impact that reading aloud had for a lot of families and a lot of communities. It was a way to get through war, illness, and loss with your family members and with your community members in a way that I don't think we could fully understand right now that we don't do it. Reading aloud as a family or as a community was not just something that improved education and gave more access to books, but it was also a way that people could show affection, and love for each other, especially in times of life that did not go as planned. The vices of reading together. This discussion would be incomplete for me without looking at the dark side of Victorian communal reading, at least from my definitely very biased perspective. Part of the downside of this practice in this time, from my perspective, was the moral policing of literature, and to some extent, some level of social control. There was a very defined idea of what was appropriate to read aloud to a mass audience, and while that makes so much sense because when you're reading to many people, you want it to be something that can be applicable to many people and can be appropriate for all the ages that might be there. At the same time, when you have the moral policing of what literature is worthwhile because you're reading it aloud and because everyone's opinions get to be there at every moment, you do have the detriments of, so to speak, like censoring some information in favor of other information that might be considered more moral by the majority of the people in the room. Literature was scrutinized and it had to align with social morals and religious values to get its time to shine. Families were encouraged to stop between passages and talk about the morality of every passage, especially when teaching their adolescents, and why I don't think that's inherently a bad idea. I think it can be dangerous when certain ideas are propped up so high and challenging them is not okay. I mean, imagine the situation of being in a middle or upper class family where you go to choose the volume for the family to read from the bookshelf to the chagrin of your grandparents who are deeply displeased with your choice of literature. And since reading at the time was so social and it was so culturally ingrained into the community, if you went off to read by yourself and solitary reading, that could be seen as suspicious. Why do you need to read alone? What could you possibly gain from reading by yourself that you couldn't gain from reading with your mother, your grandfather, or your little sister? Especially young women. Young women reading novels in the corner of the room was not unheard of in this period by any means. It was fairly common, but oftentimes people would wonder if what you were reading was good for you, if it was making your imagination too out of bounds, if it was going to make you want things that you weren't supposed to have, and if it was going to change the way you thought of the world. Some people really thought the ideal was to read as a group so that you could make sure that everyone was interpreting every text correctly for the moral values that they were supposed to have and for the positions in society that they were supposed to play. Wait, policing what women read sounds familiar for some reason. It's like it never went away. Regardless of your gender, reading alone a lot could be seen as antisocial or self-indulgent, where you are trying to get what you can out of the experience by yourself and not including other people. Like I said, why read by yourself when you can include your family or your community? People sometimes actually wondered this when they looked at an avid reader, regardless of gender. I'm going to share a quote, and this quote comes from after the period we are talking from, and it is from a Jewish German philosopher. And while it doesn't really fit in historically with the time period we're talking about, it definitely fits in with the type of attitude that these people might have had and shows that this attitude went past this era into the 1930s when this piece was written. He muses, "A man listening to a story is in the company of the storyteller. Even a man reading one shares this companionship. The reader of a novel, however, is isolated more so than any other reader, for even the reader of a poem is ready to utter the words for the benefit of the listener. In this solitude of his, the reader of a novel seizes upon his material more jealously than anyone else. He is ready to make it completely his own, to devour it, as it were. Indeed, he swallows up the material as the fire devours logs in the fireplace." So yes, there were people that would actually look at you reading your book in the corner of the room and wonder if what you were doing was selfish and self-indulgent. And while there is some benefits of reading communally, and I think there's some really interesting practices that happened in this time, the distrust of solitary reading definitely, as a modern individual, rubs me the wrong way. Reading and morality. So I hope it's been obvious from my discussion that reading and morality were intrinsically tied together in this period. And now I think a lot of us still see forms of moralizing literature in our modern perspective on books. Some books are seen as good and some books are seen as bad. Maybe we've changed the language a little bit. Maybe some books have substance and some books are fluff. But regardless, we still sort of use the moralizing language that was so prevalent in this time when we talk about what books are worth reading and what books are actually going to make our lives better. People make those judgment calls on what other people are reading all the time. And like I said, we still wonder if, for example, women are getting everything out of those little romance books that they could be getting out of reading. I do think moralizing books can definitely be a bad thing, but there I go, sort of moralizing myself by calling the moralizing of books a bad thing. I am also putting some moral weight to the practice altogether, so who can keep away from it, I guess. I just hope that we can consider the cultural and historical context to the conversation when we discuss as a community what is worth reading and what is not worth reading. What we lost. I do think we are missing out when we lose communal storytelling. For some of us, this practice of communal storytelling is something that did not die in the Victorian period, but has more recent roots, even though we are seeing less and less communal reading. For example, last month, as my extended family was sitting around the campfire, my grandfather, who was born in 1941, started singing some songs that his mom taught him as a kid. And these songs were community building, and they were stories, and there were lessons to them to some extent. And the purpose of singing these songs was not to show off your voice or to be impressive, but just to share a story with someone that you were with in person. They were simple, but when my grandfather was a little kid, everyone in his family knew them, and everyone joined in. So what are we doing instead? I know that a lot of people are still reading to their little children, especially as they're learning to read. My parents read with me, and for that I'm grateful. But I think the whole idea of communal reading is kind of out the window. People aren't really getting together and reading as adults by any means. Maybe we are meeting together online instead. For me, that isn't always a sufficient replacement. I think we lose a little bit of the human element when we only engage with ideas together online, even though I'm doing it right now, so I obviously still believe in it, but there are some weaknesses. For example, you see me right now. I don't see you. I'm glad that I can talk to you in the comments, but this is, in a way, a one-sided current conversation that will later spark a conversation, hopefully with other people, but some of that human element is lost in the process. Also, with the shortness of our attention spans, everything on the internet, even things that are like this, have to be somewhat structured, and they have to be thought of, and they have to be engaging, or you just click away. And I think when we were in person, oftentimes we were a lot more patient with each other when we were having conversations, and I also think that is a human element. There are definitely some channels that have been successful without overly structuring their content or doing any editing at all, and I think that they do kind of replicate that feeling of being in the room with a person and talking about a topic or reading a piece of literature, but it would be an over-exaggeration to call that the mainstream trend. What we gained. I'm not someone to sit around and miss a bygone era that I was never a part of. I think that we gained a lot with the changes and the way we read over the past 100 so years. Right now, you can read any genre you like, and you can surround yourself, at least in the online community, with other people who love the exact same books and the exact same things, and will be willing to have a discourse with you about it. You don't have to pick a book that both appeals to you and your grandfather. You don't have to pull out Fourth Wing and see how he reacts. There are other people who will talk to you about it, and people will generally leave you alone when you read. Sometimes when we get online, that's less so. But in real life, if you go out into the park and you're reading basically any genre, unless there is literally someone naked on the cover, people don't care. This independence is in many ways good because different voices can be heard and different pieces of literature can get traction because we're not sitting here moralizing to the same degree as we were before. We are still moralizing, but not so much that certain books are shut down. We do have a little bit of that going on with some of like the book banning discourse, but if we are to compare it to the before times, it's not the same extent. While people might still sometimes judge you for your reading choices, you can sit in the corner of a room with almost any book, and the average person looking at you will think that you are a reader who might be intelligent and is choosing to read instead of scroll on TikTok, and they will generally have a positive view of you and what you're doing. Let me know what you think of this topic. Should we moralize literature? And did we lose something when we lost communal reading, or is solitary reading really superior? If you like book history, check out this video where I show the evolution of the dust jacket with lots of visual examples.